graduate student here at the University of Texas and a member of the Austin chapter of the Campaign to End the Death Penalty. Thanks to all of you who have come out to see this event. I wanted to take a little bit of time to tell you about what you see behind me, this clothesline of strips of paper, specifically 435 strips of paper that represent the number of people that have been executed in the state of Texas since the reinstation of the death penalty in 1982. Texas is complicit in ending 435 lives, dwarfing every other state in the Union in terms of its use of the death penalty. And the purpose of this display, with these pictures, with the sheer numbers, is to send a message that I think gets left out of our conversations about the death penalty a lot in our society. And that's that these are human beings who occupy these death row cells. Human beings with families, with loved ones, many of whom are innocent. People like Carlos de Luna, Cameron Todd Willingham, and Ruben Cantu, who were executed by the state of Texas, who we now know were almost certainly innocent of the crime they were convicted of. Also, people like Rodney Reed, Luis Castro Perez are still languishing on Texas's death row for crimes they almost certainly did not commit. And then people like Kenneth Foster, thankfully, are no longer on death row for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But while there are many people who are on death row who are innocent, all of the people who are on death row, innocent or otherwise, are still victims of a criminal justice system that is rotten to its very core. And that is something that we need to talk about whenever we're discussing the death penalty. Because we live in a society with a criminal justice system that is racist, that disproportionately targets people who cannot afford adequate representation, and it's designed primarily to advance the careers of prosecutors like Scott was talking about, as well as Lawrence, and also politicians. And the death penalty is the sharpest edge of that rotten criminal justice system. It's a social mechanism that prevents ordinary people like us from asking very serious questions about where crime comes from in our society, and rather dividing us with fear, trusting that the state can simply strap someone to a gurney and solve the problem of crime in our society. However, we know that the death penalty, there's no evidence, no compelling evidence that it commits crime. Rather, we often see in places that don't have the death penalty, they have lower murder rates than places that do have the death penalty. But as a whole, I want to spend a little bit of time really putting into context what's wrong about the death penalty. One thing is that it's a racist system. Now, according to our Census Bureau, about 12% of the population of the United States is African American, just over 10%. Yet, just under half of those sentenced to death in the United States are African Americans. So, just over 10% of our population is occupying just under half of the death row cells across this country. Also, study after study tells us that the most likely victim and culprit combination to generate a death sentence is an African American defendant and a white victim, which tells us a great deal about the kinds of victims that our legal system claims to care about. As much as people who support the death penalty like to talk about closure and the needs of victims' families, let's start asking precisely what kind of victims the death penalty is really invested in and really concerned about. Rather, it's a system of dividing people and targeting ethnic minorities in a really disproportionate fashion. But also related to that, it's worth keeping in mind that virtually everyone on death row in the United States, nearly 100% of death row inmates, had to rely on court-appointed attorneys because they couldn't afford their own lawyer. That means individuals who are already overwhelmed with cases and barely receiving any money from the state are charged with defending someone in a capital case against the seemingly limitless resources of district attorneys' offices. Therefore, as we often say, those without the capital are the ones who get the punishment in our society. It's not a question of guilt or innocence, the severity of the crime, or protecting us from crime, but rather it's those who have a stature in society who can adequately defend themselves. And unfortunately, not everyone in our society has dream teams that can get them acquitted or get them a lighter sentence. It's the poor, and not even the poor, because these cases are really expensive for even middle-class people who end up on death row. But in leaving you all, I want to say, Scott said a lot about this critical juncture that we're in with the death penalty, that we're looking at eliminating the death penalty from the law of parties, making it impossible for prosecutors to charge two people side by side when only one of them pulled the trigger. And also, we have this excellent opportunity to end the career of one of Texas's most corrupt judges, the presiding judge of the Court of Criminal Appeals, Sharon Keller, who has herself said that she's pro-prosecution, yet she's a judge who's deciding the fate of so many death row inmates. And also, we see state after state after state eliminating the death penalty or thinking seriously about doing that. And the thing to keep in mind is that none of that would have been possible are out there and you have some serious concerns about the death penalty and you think it needs to be abolished, I really encourage you to come out to tonight's meeting, Voices from Death Row, and get involved in the campaign to end the death penalty. 2 summers ago, we were able to make history in Texas, convincing Rick Perry, who has presided over more executions than any governor in the history of the United States, to commute a death sentence due to outside pressure. That is unprecedented, especially in a state like Texas. And that tells us that pressure from below can create change from above. We're not going to get the death penalty removed from Texas out of the goodness of Rick Perry's heart or legislators' hearts. We're going to get it by continuing to apply pressure, by sitting in their offices and asking them questions, but also for holding signs, making noise, and raising this issue in loud, vocal, unapologetic ways. And to tackle the death penalty as part of a criminal justice system as a whole that is rotten, that needs to be challenged and restructured in some really fundamental ways. So come out to Voices from Death Row, come out to subsequent meetings, and please join us in this struggle to fight this rotten, rotten death penalty. Thank you.